It was a Tuesday morning that no one remembered until they had to. March 12th, 2025, began like so many others in Washington, D.C. A sky cast in muted gray, motorcades weaving through Capitol Hill, aides clutching coffee in one hand and briefings in the other. It was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, for what was about to erupt. Down in the lower atrium of the Rayburn House office building, a small, private memorial had been arranged for Justice Thurgood Marshall. It wasn't an official state event, no press, no televised speeches. Just a gathering of lawmakers, most of them black, who came not to perform grief, but to remember the man who changed the direction of American justice. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood near the back of the room, dressed in a muted black pantsuit. She hadn't come to be seen. She came because she owed Marshall more than silence. Her mother had taught her to read using pages from his dissents. Her law degree carried his legacy in every footnote. And yet, there she was, barely noticed, a quiet presence beneath the larger portraits of men who were now gone. At 10:04 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. A soft murmur swept through the room. The doors opened not wide, but deliberately, and in stepped Justice Clarence Thomas. No one had invited him. No one expected him. He didn't wear his robe, just a tailored charcoal suit and an expression unreadable to all but the most practiced eyes. He walked to the front without greeting anyone and stood beneath the towering image of Marshall, arms folded, back straight. For 33 years, Thomas had occupied a seat once held by Marshall. But their legacies couldn't have been further apart. One fought to expand rights. The other, critics said, worked quietly to erode them. Jasmine didn't approach him. She didn't need to. The moment had already said enough. After the closing prayer, people began filing out, but Thomas lingered. Then, as if scripted for political theater, he took 3 careful steps toward a hallway just beyond the rotunda. There, a junior correspondent from a right-leaning news outlet waited with a mic, her recorder already running. And with only a slight glance toward the ceremony still visible through the glass, Thomas muttered something low but clear enough to carry. Marshall would be ashamed of what Crockett is turning this city into. He didn't pause to see if she heard it. He didn't need to. But she did. And for Jasmine Crockett, that sentence wasn't just disrespect. It was the invisible push she had been waiting for. She didn't respond, not in that moment. Not to the journalist, not to the whispers that followed. She walked past the hallway with her head held level and returned to her office in the Longworth building without a word to the staff who trailed behind her, suddenly aware that something had shifted. Inside her office, she removed her blazer, hung it neatly, and sat down at her desk. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She opened a drawer and pulled out a tan folder, marked only with the letters TF. She'd been building that file for 6 months. Most people thought she'd moved on after the Roberts incident, that wild January when Chief Justice John Roberts had tried and failed to pressure Congress into censuring her over her Supreme Court oversight campaign. The media circus had ended. Headlines faded. But Crockett hadn't moved on. She had moved inward. That folder held records, financial disclosures scrubbed of truth, luxury gifts underreported, speaking engagements arranged through third parties, and a trail of soft influence emails, texts, and connections traced from the Thomas household to people who had very real business before the highest court in the land. She hadn't rushed it. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. Clarence Thomas wasn't just a judge. He was an institution, a fortress built on 3 decades of silence and power. To confront him without precision would be suicide, so she waited. But after this morning, she knew waiting was over. That sentence, Marshall would be ashamed, was more than petty. It was Thomas reclaiming a throne he thought was his by virtue of time served, not trust earned. It was a warning, dressed as contempt. He believed she'd flinch. He didn't know she'd already been preparing for war. That night, as most of Washington continued about its usual rhythm, something different stirred inside Crockett's team. Her chief of staff canceled the next day's non-essential meetings. Her communications director quietly began drafting language that could serve multiple purpose op-ed, press release, speech. But Crockett herself didn't rush to go public. She knew this would be her most defining fight, and she refused to waste it on impulse. Instead, she made a phone call to her mother in Dallas. They didn't talk about politics. They never did. Her mother hated the spotlight. But that night, Jasmine told her everything about the file, the whispers, the moment in the hallway. Her mother said only this: "Then make him hear you, the way they made us quiet make them hear you." That was all Jasmine needed. She hung up the phone, stood before her office window, and stared across the National Mall, past the monuments, past the tourists, past the polished white of the Capitol dome. It wasn't about Clarence Thomas anymore. It was about the story that hadn't been told, the version of accountability that didn't involve scandal for scandal's sake, but something bigger, something necessary, a quiet reckoning. And when she finally turned off the lights and left her office just after midnight, the file marked TF wasn't in her drawer anymore. It was in her bag, ready, waiting, because come morning, the world wouldn't be the same. Jasmine Crockett knew that in Washington, the most dangerous woman in the room is the one who's underestimated, especially when she's quiet. 6 months earlier, while the rest of the country was distracted by midterm fever and cable news shouting matches, Crockett was watching. Not the headlines, the footnotes, not the outrage, the omissions. It started with a single sentence buried in a quarterly disclosure. A gift reported late, a travel itinerary that didn't align, a private flight marked as a consultation, nothing that screamed scandal. Nothing that would raise alarms for anyone not trained to see the gaps between what's written and what's true. But Crockett had been trained. Long before she entered Congress, before the Roberts standoff made her a household name, she'd worked civil rights law in Texas where power cloaked itself in legal formality. She'd defended clients who had been steamrolled by systems built to silence. She knew how institutions covered their tracks, and she knew the importance of details. The moment she saw that line in Justice Thomas's records, she felt the pattern. It wasn't explosive, not yet. But it was familiar. And it was enough. She called in a favor from a forensic accountant she'd worked with during her litigation days, an older black woman named Bernice, who never appeared on camera, never charged more than she needed, and had once cracked a housing fraud ring using only church bulletins and property tax records. Bernice didn't ask why Crockett was looking. She just asked where to start. And that's when the building began. No headlines, no leaks, just long nights in a basement room of the Capitol complex, the kind without windows, where staffers often joke justice goes to nap. They weren't looking for a smoking gun. They were tracing fibers, financial, personal, ideological, through public documents, donor lists, obscure nonprofits, and whispers. And what they found was something colder than corruption. It was calculation. Justice Clarence Thomas hadn't just been accepting gifts from billionaire donors. He had been embedding himself into the fabric of influence, speaking at private events under pseudonyms, appearing at closed-door policy retreats, offering advice to lawmakers under the guise of mentorship. He wasn't breaking laws. He was bending them until they no longer meant anything. But still, Crockett didn't speak. Not publicly. Not even to allies on the Judiciary Committee. To them, she remained the rising star with a biting wit and a calm voice. She asked sharp questions during hearings but never grandstanded. She stood firm when Republicans pushed back, but never took the bait. She was, in the eyes of the public, a poised young lawmaker with fight. But behind closed doors, she was collecting kindling. And she was going to wait for the spark. That patience was tested, especially when headlines broke about another justice's speaking engagement, or when reporters speculated about her next move. Even her own staff didn't know how much she was holding. She played the part so well, showing up to committee briefings with coffee for everyone, nodding politely when a senior Republican condescended to explain separation of powers like she hadn't taught constitutional law. She even laughed at their jokes. But every smile carried weight. Because Jasmine Crockett had watched this town long enough to know power doesn't crack under pressure, it cracks under silence. And she was done waiting for the rules to save her. One night in late January, after everyone else had gone home, she sat alone in her office reading over a text message. Not her own. It was from Thomas, to a known political donor. A message about keeping the lights on at the court, a favor for a favor. It was vague. But in her hands, it was the first tile in a path she had long suspected existed. She turned off the lamp on her desk and sat in the dark. She thought about her mother, who had once stood in line for 5 hours in Dallas to cast a vote only to be told her polling place had moved 10 blocks away. No signage, no notice. She remembered how angry she'd been that night, back when she was in law school, and how her mother had simply smiled and said, "Don't get mad, baby. Just get even with your pen." That memory stayed with her. Because now, in this town of marble and myth, Jasmine had the pen. And she was writing something no one expected from her. A case not just against Clarence Thomas, but against the myth that the Supreme Court was untouchable. But still, she stayed silent. Because the most dangerous truth is the one wrapped in restraint. She knew that if she moved too soon, the machine would swallow her. They'd paint her as partisan, as emotional, as radical. They'd accuse her of attacking a black man out of ambition. And they would bury the truth in political noise. So she waited. She took meetings. She voted on bills. She posed for photos. She even attended one of the very judicial receptions where Thomas's allies hovered. And when they smiled at her, as if to say, "We know our place in this city," she smiled right back. Because she did too. And it wasn't beneath them. It was beyond them. When Thomas released his public demand for her resignation that Tuesday morning, he thought it would silence her. He thought she'd retreat or lash out, giving him and his defenders exactly what they needed to dismiss her as unruly, unprofessional, unfit. But Jasmine had already written the story. She had facts, receipts, testimonies, leaked recordings, ethics violations, and most of all, she had time. Time spent quietly compiling a truth too dangerous to reveal until the country was forced to hear it. She didn't walk into this reckoning by accident. She built it. Every quiet hearing, every polite nod, every smile that masked fury was a step. Now the mask was slipping. And she hadn't raised her voice once. The press didn't know what to do with it at first. The official statement from Justice Clarence Thomas dropped at exactly 9:42 a.m. on March 13th. It was brief, oddly personal, and completely unprecedented. Representative Jasmine Crockett has demonstrated conduct unbecoming of her office. Her persistent efforts to undermine the court's independence, coupled with her inflammatory rhetoric, make her unfit to serve in Congress. For the good of the nation, I call upon her to resign immediately. It didn't come from a think tank, not from a political surrogate. It came directly from the Supreme Court's official press office. The legal world froze. Within minutes, court analysts on MSNBC were citing tradition, gasping at the break from decorum. On Fox News, anchors cheered it as a long overdue stand against radicals. But across both sides, the consensus was clear. This wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. A sitting justice demanding the resignation of an elected member of Congress? It hadn't happened in modern American history. The New York Times ran a headline within the hour. Judicial earthquake. Thomas calls for Crockett's resignation. Crockett, however, said nothing. She made no press appearance, gave no quote. That silence was more deafening than outrage ever could have been. Behind closed doors, her team huddled in the shadow of a storm they had seen coming. Crockett stood at the head of the conference table, arms folded, the tan folder marked TF in front of her. No one touched it. She looked at them calmly and asked, "Are we ready?" No one spoke. They simply nodded. By noon, her office sent out a press advisory. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett will hold a live press conference at 2 p.m. tomorrow. in room 216 of the Rayburn House Office Building. Topic: Response to Justice Thomas's public demand. That was all. No leak, no talking points. And yet by sunset, the city pulsed with tension. Cable news went into round-the-clock speculation. Congressional aides whispered about subpoenas and sealed files. Justice Department officials began scrambling to distance themselves from the storm. And across D.C., there was a single, shared question. What does she have? That night, the lights in the Capitol stayed on longer than usual. Crockett's office, so normally quiet after 8 p.m., glowed past midnight. Her staff combed over printouts, timestamps, transcripts. Not just for impact, but for accuracy. Crockett herself spent most of that time alone. She didn't rehearse. She didn't practice zingers. She read the documents again slowly. She wasn't building a performance. She was building a reckoning. At 11 p.m., she posted a single tweet. Tomorrow, Justice Thomas will learn that some silences were never fear. They were preparation. It went viral within 30 minutes. By morning, room 216 was flooded. Reporters from every major network were already lined up. Protesters gathered outside the building, some waving signs that read, "Defend the court," others, "Accountability now." At exactly 2:00 p.m., Crockett walked into the room. No entourage, no theatrics, just her. She wore a navy blue suit, the same one she'd worn during the Roberts hearings, and carried a folder and a tablet. Her expression was calm, unmoving. She placed the folder on the podium, adjusted the mic, and waited for the room to quiet. Then she began. Yesterday, Justice Clarence Thomas demanded my resignation. Today, I respond not with outrage, but with truth, and not my truth his. The room hushed. She opened the folder and took out a printed transcript. Let's begin with a text message sent from Justice Thomas to political donor Gregory Slater on April 18th of last year. It reads, and I quote, "If Crockett keeps pushing, we'll make sure she sees what happens to people who challenge the bench." A murmur spread through the room. She raised her hand not to silence them, but to steady the moment. This message was recovered through lawful subpoena from congressional oversight investigations into undisclosed communications between judiciary members and political actors. But it is not an isolated case. For the next 20 minutes, Crockett read texts between Thomas and lobbyists discussing pending cases, calendar entries showing off-the-record dinners with executives whose cases appeared on the court's docket, voice notes shared between Thomas and operatives, strategizing responses to Supreme Court reform, bills specifically hers. Every word was cited, every sentence carefully measured. But the tone that carried it was not anger. It was precise, grave, relentless. At the 30-minute mark, she paused. Her eyes scanned the room press, aides, staffers, some visibly shaken. Justice Thomas has claimed that he serves with honor, that he protects this institution's dignity. So let me read you one final message on the night Congress passed the Voting Rights Expansion Act. She lifted the page. From Clarence Thomas to his wife, Ginny Thomas. The court won't save them forever, but tomorrow I'll make them think it still can. Let them hope. It makes the fall better. The silence was so complete. You could hear someone breathing wrong. Then she said it. This isn't just about ethics. It's about contempt for the very people this court was meant to protect. Crockett closed the folder, picked up her tablet. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to play a recording. It was short, 43 seconds. But in that time, the country heard Clarence Thomas speaking to an unnamed political advisor, caught in a private conversation, saying, "I don't lose sleep over these progressives. We've got power, and we've got time. Crockett, she's a noise, and noise fades." When the recording ended, Crockett didn't move for a moment. Then, quietly, "He was wrong. I'm not noise. I'm witness." And she walked off the podium, no mic drop, no raised fist, no chant. Just that. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. It was already shifting. A curtain had slipped, and behind it stood a man who had hidden behind robes and rituals for over 3 decades. But now, the public had seen him. Not a guardian of justice, a gambler of power. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't just pulled back the curtain. She'd shown the country what had been behind it all along. The next 24 hours felt like the eye of a storm. There was no press release from Clarence Thomas, no defiant tweet, not even a denial from the Supreme Court, just a silence that seemed to confirm the worst. Cable news shows spun themselves into frenzy. Editorials dropped by the hour. Legal experts whispered what had once been unthinkable: impeachment. But Jasmine Crockett stayed quiet. She didn't call for his resignation yet. She didn't demand accountability in capital letters. She simply let the room breathe, let the weight of what had just been revealed settle into the public conscience. She understood something most in Washington never learn. If you speak too fast, you let them outrun the truth. But if you wait just long enough, their own words will do the cutting. By the morning of March 15th, headlines had turned. What began as a confrontation was now a reckoning. The Thomas tapes. Is the court compromised? Crockett's case. A congresswoman's unlikely crusade against a giant. The texts heard around the nation. And then, Thomas made his next and final mistake. That night, he appeared on The American Standard, a conservative webcast hosted by former talk radio host Gavin Trent. Thomas, looking weary but resolute, spoke into the camera with an edge of indignation. "I have served on this court for over 30 years, he said. "I will not be intimidated by political theater. These so-called revelations are distortions, fabrications taken out of context by a radical leftist with an agenda. I will not apologize for having friends or opinions." But then, he went further. "I've read the Constitution. I know what it says. Congresswoman Crockett may enjoy her moment on television, but real authority isn't won with microphones. It's earned over time, by people who understand power." The clip went viral in under an hour. And just like that, he gave her everything she needed. The next morning, Crockett stood before the House Oversight Committee for a press conference, but for a procedural hearing. On paper, it had nothing to do with Thomas. It was about a budget line item for judicial security. But everyone in that room knew what was coming. When it was her turn to speak, she began slowly, even kindly. "Mr. Chairman, before we proceed with the committee's agenda, I'd like to offer a brief statement. For the record." The chairman nodded. And then Jasmine Crockett unsheathed the blade. Justice Thomas has reminded us just last night, in his own words, that authority is not given. It is earned. That real power is in the hands of those who understand the law. I couldn't agree more. She turned a page in her binder. Her voice was steady, controlled. "Let's talk about authority. Let's talk about the authority Clarence Thomas used to conceal over $3.5 million in gifts from undisclosed donors. Authority he used to influence cases tied to companies whose executives he dined with weeks before oral arguments. Authority he used when he helped a private donor reshape environmental law while planning summer vacations with that same donor's family." No one interrupted. She kept going. "Let's talk about power, real power, like the power to rewrite the Voting Rights Act with a single vote, even as you text your spouse about how liberal tears make this job worth it." Gasps rippled across the room. But Crockett didn't flinch. Real power, Justice Thomas, doesn't come from tenure. It doesn't come from black robes or marble halls. It comes from responsibility, from restraint, from knowing that your silence in the courtroom must be matched by silence when power tempts you to speak outside of it. Then she pulled out a printed transcript again, his own words. In 2023, at a Federalist Society event held off record, Justice Thomas stated, "We are the final word. Congress changes, presidents change, but we endure. That's why we must protect our influence." She paused. Influence is not justice, and enduring isn't the same as serving. Now her voice dropped, still calm, but unmistakably firm. "You see, the Constitution doesn't say you're untouchable, Justice Thomas. It says you're appointed to serve. It says you're accountable to the P.O. plenot above them. And you can quote it from the bench or twist it behind closed doors, but either way, it will not protect you from your own words. The room was dead quiet. She leaned forward. You said Congress has no authority over the court, that we're just a noisy chamber of politics. But I'll remind you, sir, your seat was created by Article 3, ours by Article 1. And in this republic, one branch does not kneel to another. Now she closed the binder. You told America I was unfit, that I should resign. But here's the difference between you and me, Justice Thomas. I don't serve for perks. I don't hide behind precedent. And I don't stay silent when silence becomes complicity. Then, as calmly as she had begun, she made it official. This morning, I have filed a formal resolution to initiate impeachment proceedings against Justice Clarence Thomas. The documents are public. The evidence is cited, and every word in it yours. The room didn't erupt. It broke open. Flashes, murmurs, phones lighting up, aides sprinting to relay the news. But Crockett didn't react. She gathered her binder, smiled gently, and left the room. Outside, on the Capitol steps, reporters rushed to meet her. Some asked if she feared political fallout. Others pressed her on whether she believed she could actually win. She didn't answer those questions. Instead, she looked toward the cameras and said, "He said I was a threat to constitutional order. I'm not. I'm its correction." That quote would lead every headline. I'm its correction. Rep. Jasmine Crockett, March 16, 2025. Within hours, support began to build. Some Democrats moved quickly. Progressives called it historic. But what surprised the nation were the quiet voices that began to emerge on the other side: Republican legal scholars, conservative judges, even one retired justice who issued a statement that read, "Public trust in the court depends not on our ideology, but our integrity. If the evidence holds, resignation is not a concession, it's an obligation." Behind the scenes, things moved even faster. The House Judiciary Committee fast-tracked a review. The Justice Department confirmed it had received Crockett's files. Ethics watchdogs released detailed analyses validating her evidence. But perhaps the most unexpected signal came from the court itself. By Friday afternoon, a rare internal leak revealed that Chief Justice John Roberts had called an emergency closed-door session with the remaining justices. Sources confirmed that the meeting's focus was reputational containment. Translation: they were ready to isolate Thomas. That night, Crockett sat in her office alone. She didn't celebrate, didn't smile. She looked out at the Capitol dome, lit like a monument but flickering, as if unsure whether to shine brighter or dim in shame. She whispered to herself, so softly no one could hear, "I didn't want this fight, but I wasn't going to run from it either." And in that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman. She was something else entirely. The blade that cut not with rage, but with reason. A blade they never saw coming. The letter came quietly. No press conference, no televised announcement, no final speech from the bench. At 6:04 p.m. on March 17, 2025, exactly 5 days after he had called for Jasmine Crockett's resignation, Clarence Thomas submitted his own. It was one page, typed, signed, delivered through the Supreme Court's official communication channel. After 33 years of service, I hereby resign from my position as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, effective immediately. I continue to believe I served with honor. I offer no further comment. No apology, no reckoning, just silence. But the echo was already too loud to ignore. News broke across every channel within minutes. Networks cleared their primetime lineups. Banners blazed across screens. Clarence Thomas resigns. Justice falls. From bench to breakdown. In living rooms across America, viewers sat stunned. Not because a resignation had come, but because, for the first time in recent memory, power had backed down without a deal, without a spin, without a shield. And at the center of that storm stood Jasmine Crockett, not gloating, not dancing in victory, but simply standing in the place where truth had finally spoken louder than title. Inside the Capitol, reactions were divided not by party, but by conscience. Some lawmakers avoided cameras altogether. Others, particularly those who had once defended Thomas publicly, issued carefully worded statements about preserving institutional integrity. But the faces told the deeper story of shame, of retreat, of quiet calculations about what might come next. But Crockett didn't gloat. When she stepped in front of the press for the first time since the resignation, she wore no color of triumph, just gray, and a voice sharpened not by vengeance, but by responsibility. This was never about revenge, she said. It was about restoring the idea that no one nut, even a Supreme Court justice, is beyond accountability. She didn't thank political allies. She didn't call out those who doubted her. Instead, she called for something bigger. We need structural reform, we need clear ethical standards, and we need to remove the illusion that tenure is the same as trust. She ended the statement with a single line: Justice Thomas has resigned, but the echoes of his choices will not. And she was right. Because even as Thomas vanished from public view, the systems that had protected him for so long began to crack open. 3 days later, the Department of Justice announced the formal launch of a criminal investigation into potential tax fraud, bribery, and obstruction. It cited evidence obtained through lawful congressional oversight and named Clarence and Ginny Thomas as individuals under review. Subpoenas followed, then interviews, then grand jury deliberations. Weeks later, indictments landed with charges that spanned decades. For the first time in history, a former Supreme Court justice faced a federal trial for corruption. And even then, Crockett stayed quiet. But beyond the courtroom, something else began to shift. Law schools restructured their ethics curriculum. A once overlooked section of the Constitution, Article 3, became the centerpiece of national discussion. Think tanks issued white papers calling for judicial term limits. Editorials argued for a new era of court transparency. Even Chief Justice John Roberts, who had once defended Thomas behind closed doors, made a rare televised appearance where he said, "The court's strength lies not in its longevity, but in its legitimacy. That legitimacy must now be earned back." Congress responded. Within months, the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act passed with bipartisan support, creating a permanent ethics office for the federal judiciary, requiring public disclosures of gifts and mandating recusal from any case involving a donor or political affiliate. For the first time, the highest court in the land would answer not just to history but to oversight. And still, Crockett never claimed credit. She declined interviews with major outlets, refused cover stories. She went back to committee meetings, back to town halls, back to where she had always done her real work, in the quiet places, where change didn't need cameras to matter. But the country hadn't forgotten. A mural appeared in Atlanta, Georgia, 4 stories high, of a black woman in a Navy suit, standing with a folder in one hand and the Constitution in the other. Underneath, just 2 words: "We heard." And across social media, a phrase began to surface used in moments when truth rose above noise, when silence turned into something sharper than speech. She Crocketed it. Meanwhile, Clarence Thomas vanished from the public stage. He declined interviews, avoided public functions. His memoir deal evaporated. His speaking invitations disappeared. His name became less a reference to jurisprudence than a cautionary tale. But the most haunting moment came quietly, months later, at a small university law panel in North Carolina. A student barely 20 stood up during QA and asked a retired federal judge, "Do you think what happened to Justice Thomas was unfair?" The judge didn't blink. He just sighed and said, "There's a difference between being remembered and being repeated. He'll be remembered, but we won't repeat him." That, more than the verdicts, more than the resignation, was the echo. Back in Washington, Crockett sat alone one evening in her office, looking out at a city that never truly sleeps. She had just come from a policy roundtable in affordable housing, not the court. The cameras were gone. The adrenaline had long since faded. But as she looked out at the Capitol dome, lit against the dusk, she whispered the same line her mother had said years ago when a voting site had moved without notice. "Don't get mad, baby. Just get even with your pen." Only now, her pen had done more than correct injustice. It had made history. Without shouting, without vengeance, without violence. Just truth. And a voice strong enough to carry long after the room had gone quiet. Sometimes the most powerful truths don't arrive with applause. They arrive in silence, spoken once, but echoing for generations. What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just about holding someone accountable. It was about refusing to believe that quiet means powerless. That just because the room falls still, the story has ended. Because sometimes, the silence is the turning point. Let me ask you, have you ever stood in a moment where speaking up felt impossible? Where the weight of a system or a name or even a room full of silence made you feel like you didn't belong? What did you do? And if you held your ground, how did it change you? Because maybe you didn't raise your voice. Maybe you didn't fight the way others expected. But just like Jasmine, maybe your stillness held something sharper than any argument. Maybe it held truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. This story is a reminder that resilience doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly, listens deeply, and waits until the moment comes to stand, speak, and shift the world by simply refusing to look away. If this story moved you, share it. Not just with friends, but with someone who might be holding on to their voice in a room that doesn't want to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Because the stories we tell here are about more than headlines. They're about the dignity of staying grounded, even when the ground shakes. As Jasmine Crockett once said, "I'm not noise, I'm witness." We'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.